The rain came down on Greenwich, Connecticut, the way grief comes down on a man who has lost everything. Slow at first, then steady, then without mercy. It hammered against the tall windows of the Bennett estate, blurring the manicured hedges and the long stone driveway into a wash of gray. Inside the mahogany-paneled study, the fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth never seemed to reach the corners of the room. The corners were cold. The corners had always been cold. Adeline Bennett stood in the center of that room, 18 years old today, holding a worn canvas duffel bag against her chest like a shield. There was no cake. There were no candles. There was no song. There was only her father. Garrett Bennett sat behind the great oak desk that had once belonged to his own father, the desk where a Bennett man had signed shipping contracts for nearly 50 years. He wore a tailored suit the color of charcoal. His silver cufflinks caught the firelight. His eyes did not. He looked at his daughter the way a banker looks at a foreclosure notice. "You made your choice, Adeline," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. Adeline had grown up in this house, and she had learned long ago that her father's quiet voice was the dangerous one. The shouting voice was theater. The quiet voice was law. "I gave you every advantage a girl in this country could ever ask for," he continued. "Private tutors, boarding school in Switzerland, a guaranteed seat at Yale, an executive track at Bennett Maritime the day you graduated. I arranged a marriage with Spencer Ashford that would have linked our company to the oldest shipping family on the eastern seaboard. And what did you do with all of it?" He picked up a heavy crystal tumbler. He did not drink from it. "You threw it in my face for what, environmental science, some state college, up in Vermont, where they teach girls to hug trees and write angry letters to senators." The fire popped. A log shifted. Adeline did not answer. She had learned long ago that her answers did not matter in this room. By the fireplace, in a wingback chair upholstered in burgundy leather, sat Lenora Crawford Bennett, her stepmother, the woman who had moved into this house 6 months after Adeline's mother had been buried, and who had never once pretended to mourn. Lenora was beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful. Cold metal, a clean edge. She held a glass of Pinot Noir between two manicured fingers, and a small smile played at the corner of her mouth. "Garrett, darling," Lenore said softly, "don't upset yourself. We knew this day was coming. She is, after all, exactly her mother's daughter. Stubborn, sentimental, always reaching for the wrong things." Adeline's jaw tightened. She felt the words rise in her throat before she could stop them. "My mother built half of this company before you pushed her out." The room went still. Garrett Bennett rose slowly from his chair. The fire threw his shadow long and crooked across the wall behind him. "Do not," he said, and his voice was very low now, "speak of your mother in this house." He moved to a small wooden tray on the corner of the desk. On the tray sat a single faded manila envelope. He picked it up between his thumb and forefinger as though it carried disease, and he flicked it across the polished surface of the desk. The envelope slid off the edge and landed with a soft slap at Adeline's feet. "There," he said, "there is your inheritance. The deed to your grandfather's cabin in the Adirondack Mountains. 20 acres of rotting timber and useless granite. He left it to you in his will. I'd have fought it in probate for 2 years because I believed a child should not be burdened with that man's delusions. I lost. So now it is yours." He stepped back to the desk, picked up a manila folder, and tossed it onto the surface. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, your trust fund is dissolved. Your credit cards are canceled. Your phone is deactivated. Your name has been removed from the household insurance, the medical policy, and the family attorney's contact list. You are no longer a Bennett." He looked at her. There was no anger in his face. There was something worse than anger. There was nothing. "Take your bag, take your car, take your envelope, and get out of my house before I have security walk you to the gate." Adeline knelt slowly and picked up the envelope. Her hands were shaking, and she hated that they were shaking, and she could not make them stop. Inside the envelope was a single iron key mottled with rust heavy as a small stone. The key was strange. Too long, the teeth were uneven, asymmetrical, almost hand-cut. It looked like something a man might forge himself in a workshop in the dead of winter when he had time to think about what he was building and why. She closed her fingers around it. She walked out of the study without looking back. She walked across the marble foyer where she had taken her first steps as a baby. She walked past the staircase where her mother had carried her up to bed 1,000 times. She walked through the great oak doors and out into the rain. The Subaru waited in the circular drive, a 1998 Outback dark green with one cracked headlight and a back bumper held together by patience and electrical tape. It was titled in her name. Her grandfather had bought it for her on her 16th birthday and registered it that same afternoon, and she had not understood at the time why he had been so insistent about the paperwork. She understood now. She tossed the duffel into the back seat, climbed in, and started the engine. The rain on the windshield was so heavy she could barely see the wrought iron gates as they swung open to let her out. She did not cry until she reached the highway. She pulled onto the shoulder near a stand of dripping pines, killed the engine, and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, and she let the sound of the rain on the roof do what no one in that house had ever done. She let it hold her. When she lifted her head, she opened the banking app on her phone before she remembered the phone would not work much longer. $412, half a tank of gas, a rusted key to a cabin in the woods. That was the sum of her life at 18 years old. The drive from Greenwich to the Adirondacks took 6 hours. The interstates gave way to state routes. The state routes gave way to county roads. The county roads gave way to logging tracks where the asphalt cracked and lifted and the center line simply stopped existing. The pines rose taller and taller until they shut out the sky, and the headlights of the Subaru cut a narrow yellow tunnel through the dark. As she drove, Adeline let herself remember. She let herself remember the man who had built the cabin she was driving toward. His name was Wendell Bennett, but to her he had only ever been Grandpa Wen. Wendell had served 26 years in the United States Navy before he had ever signed a single shipping contract. He had come up through the cold waters of the North Atlantic during the long, quiet years of the Cold War, commanding intelligence vessels that shadowed Soviet submarines beneath the gray surface of the sea. He had retired as a captain with a chest full of ribbons he never wore and a knowledge of global shipping lanes that had no equal in the private sector. When he came home, he built Bennett Maritime Logistics from a single rented warehouse in New London. The first ship he ever leased was a battered cargo vessel called the Providence. He had told Adeline once that he named her after the city in the city after a virtue. Providence, he had said, it means looking ahead. It means seeing what's coming before other men do. He had taken her up to the cabin every summer from the time she was 4 years old. She remembered sitting on his lap on the front porch at dusk, the sound of cicadas thick in the trees while he taught her to whittle. He gave her a little folding knife with a deer antler handle. He showed her how to find the grain. He showed her where the wood wanted to give and where it wanted to resist. The wood will tell you what it wants to be, he said. You just have to listen. He taught her to shoot a .22 rifle at tin cans set on a fence rail. He taught her to read a topographical map. He taught her the names of the constellations and how to find true north when the compass failed. He taught her how to bake biscuits in a cast iron skillet over an open fire. And he taught her one other thing which she had not understood until tonight. She had been 12 years old. They had been sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the ridge. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had turned to her, and his eyes had been very serious in a way she had never seen before. Adeline, he had said, listen to me, sweetheart. The world only sees the fresh paint. They look at a man and they see his suit, and they see his car, and they see the smile he wears at parties, and they think that's what he is. But the paint is just a coat. The truth is in the canvas underneath. Whatever you do in this life, you remember to check the canvas. She had laughed. She had thought it was just one of his old sailor sayings. He had not laughed back. Wendell had died when Adeline was 16, 2 years before the morning her father threw her out of the house. The funeral had been in Greenwich. Her father had given a eulogy in which he praised his own father's business acumen and never once mentioned the Navy. He had buried Wendell in the family plot beside Cassandra Bennett, the wife who had gone before him, and he had not shed a tear. The will had read out a week later. The cabin and the 20 acres around it were left to Adeline to be transferred on her 18th birthday. Her father had filed an immediate challenge in probate court, claiming the property was a corporate asset and that his father had been mentally unfit at the time of the bequest. The lawsuit had ground on for 2 years. And then 2 weeks ago, with no explanation, Garrett Bennett had withdrawn his challenge. He had signed the paperwork. He had handed his daughter the deed. He had handed her the cabin. She had not understood why. She was beginning to understand now. It was nearly midnight when her headlights caught the reflective tin of a leaning mailbox. The numbers on the side, painted by hand decades ago, had faded to ghosts. 842 Hollow Creek Road. She turned in. The driveway was a quarter-mile of gravel that had not been graded in years. The Subaru bucked and slid through the ruts. Branches scraped along the doors, and then the trees opened up and she saw it. The cabin. It was worse than she had pictured. The roof sagged under a winter's worth of pine needles and a summer's worth of moss. The porch steps had rotted clean through in 2 places. Ivy had crawled halfway up the western wall and into the eaves. One window was cracked. Another was boarded shut with a piece of plywood that had warped in the weather. This was her inheritance. This was the great gift her grandfather had left her, and her father had fought 2 years to keep her from receiving. For a moment, sitting there in the dark with the rain still pattering on the roof of the car, Adeline let herself wonder if her father had been right after all. If the old man had truly lost his mind in those last years. If she had been a fool to trust the memory of a dead sailor over the cold accounting of a living CEO. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. She got out of the car. She climbed the rotten porch steps, carefully testing each board. She slid the iron key into the front door lock. It turned smoothly, far more smoothly than a lock that had been abandoned for 2 years should have turned. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was cold. The air smelled of mildew and old paper and wood smoke gone stale on the bricks. She found a kerosene lamp on the kitchen counter, a box of long matches in the drawer below it, and she got the wick lit on the second try. The yellow flame threw shadows up the walls. She found a wool blanket folded inside a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. The mice had been at one corner of it, but the rest was sound. She wrapped it around her shoulders and lay down on a sagging canvas sofa in front of the fireplace, and she shivered there until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Her last thought before she slept was of her grandfather's voice on a summer porch telling her to check the canvas. She woke to sunlight. It came through the cracked windows in long dusty beams, and for a moment she did not remember where she was. Then she remembered, and the weight of it settled back onto her chest. She got up. She walked through the cabin in the daylight, and she cataloged what she had. The cabin was one main room with a kitchen at one end, a bedroom partitioned off in the back, and a small bathroom whose pipes had clearly been drained for the season. The furniture was old but solid. The bookshelves along the walls were full of paperbacks, naval histories, atlases, and engineering manuals. A brass barometer hung beside the front door. A framed photograph of the USS Providence sat on the mantelpiece. And on the mantelpiece, carved into the wide oak beam that ran the length of the fireplace, was a panorama her grandfather had whittled himself over many winters. Pine trees, a leaping buck, a black bear standing on its hind legs, an owl with its wings spread, and at the far right end of the mantel, a wolf. The wolf was the largest of the carvings. Its head was lifted, its mouth slightly open, its ears pricked forward, and where the eyes should have been, there was only a deep round hole drilled into the wood. Adeline did not notice it yet. She was tired and she was hungry, and she had work to do before she could think about decorations. She spent the morning hauling ruined furniture out onto the front lawn, A waterlogged armchair, a stained mattress, a box of magazines that had been chewed to nesting material by generations of mice. She tore down cobwebs. She swept the floor. She found a hand pump in the kitchen that after 20 minutes of effort finally drew up clear cold water from a well below the cabin. She drank 3 cupfuls and felt for the first time in 24 hours almost alive. It was a little after noon when she heard the truck. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel, the slow approach of an engine that knew the road well. She froze in the middle of the kitchen. Her father's words from the night before came rushing back to her. Security, surveyors, the girl is on her own now. She crossed quickly to the fireplace and took up the cast iron poker. She moved to the front window and pulled the edge of the curtain aside with one finger. A pickup truck had stopped in the driveway behind her Subaru. An old Ford F-150, faded red with a toolbox bolted in the bed. A man stood beside it. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, dressed in a flannel shirt and a canvas work jacket that had seen many seasons. His hair was iron gray, cropped close. He was looking at her license plate. He turned toward the cabin. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had once been very fast and had learned over the years that careful was better than fast. Adeline took a steadying breath. She set the poker down beside the door, but kept it within reach, and she stepped out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" she called. The man looked up. He did not startle. His eyes, pale gray under heavy brows, took her in slowly. "Well," he said, "I'll be." He took off his cap. He held it in both hands. "You'd be Wendell's granddaughter." It was not a question. "My name's Adeline," she said carefully. "Wendell Bennett was my grandfather. This is my property now." The man nodded slowly. He looked her over with an expression that was not unkind but was very, very serious. "My name is Silas Tobin," he said. "I live 3 miles down the ridge off the old fire road. Your grandfather and I served together on the Providence back when men still navigated by stars and trusted the radar half the time." Adeline lowered her hand from the doorframe. "You knew him." "I knew him from when he was 22 years old and didn't know port from starboard. I knew him until the day he died." Silas paused. "And I knew him well enough to know he would not want me standing here on this porch chatting with you while you're in the kind of trouble you're in." The wind moved through the pines. A jay called from somewhere in the timber. "What kind of trouble?" Adeline asked quietly. Silas put his cap back on his head. He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Adeline," he said, "I think you better come down off that porch and let me show you something." She followed him down the steps and around the side of the cabin. He walked her along the perimeter of the house and he pointed. "You see those tracks? Heavy equipment. Big tracks. That's an excavator tread. That right there is from a low-bed trailer. They were turning around in the side yard." "Who?" "A demolition outfit out of Albany. Pulled in here 8 days ago. 6 men, 2 trucks, a survey crew. Said they had a contract to bring this whole place down by the end of the month. Said the structure had been condemned as a safety hazard. Said they had paperwork from the county." "Did they?" "They had paperwork. Whether the paperwork was real, I couldn't tell you. They flashed it at me from a distance, and they didn't appreciate me asking questions." Silas looked at her sidelong. "I came up from down the ridge on my own time, and I told them they were not to touch one board of this cabin until I had spoken with the granddaughter of the man who built it. They told me to mind my own affairs." "What did you do?" A small, tired smile pulled at the corner of Silas Tobin's mouth. "I have been minding people's affairs for 71 years, miss. I told them I would mind theirs all the way to the county sheriff's office if they so much as scuffed a shingle. They left, but they will come back. They were planning to be back next Tuesday." Adeline felt cold travel up her spine. It was not the cold of the October morning. It was something deeper. "Mr. Tobin," she said, "did they go inside?" "They tried." He looked at the cabin. "Your grandfather, miss, was a very particular man about this place. About 15 years ago, he had me drive him down to a steel fabricator outside Utica. He had reinforced doors and frames built to spec. He paneled them in old cedar so they look like regular cabin doors, but the cores are solid steel. The locks are custom, the hinges are concealed. To get into this cabin without a key, you would need an industrial cutting torch in a couple of hours. They could not get in, so they were going to come back with the excavator and bring the whole thing down on top of itself and then sift through the wreckage. He turned to face her fully. Now, miss, I am an old man. I am not a man who jumps at shadows. But you tell me this. Your father just had this place handed over to you after fighting it in court for 2 years. And now, before you've so much as set foot on the property, he has paid an outfit out of Albany tens of thousands of dollars to flatten a cabin he claims is worthless. Why? Adeline did not answer. She did not have to. The same question had been forming in her own mind since the moment she had seen the tracks. Mr. Tobin, she said quietly, I think I need to be alone for a little while. He nodded. He understood. My truck is here every evening by 5. You see smoke from the second hollow over, that's me. You knock on my door at any hour of the day or night, miss, you understand. Wendell Bennett carried my hide off a burning bridge in 1979, and I have owed him every breath I've drawn since. The debt transfers to his blood. You knock and I answer. He climbed back into the old Ford. The engine coughed to life. He raised one hand to her through the windshield, and then he was gone down the gravel. Adeline stood in the silent yard for a long time after the sound of the truck had faded. Then she turned and she walked back inside the cabin, and she locked the door behind her. Her hands were no longer shaking. Something else had taken the place of the fear, something cold and patient, and her grandfather's. She went back to the main room and stood in the center of it. She turned in a slow circle. She looked at the bookshelves, at the stone hearth, at the rough beams of the ceiling. The world only sees the fresh paint. She began to search. She started with the floors. She lifted the rugs one by one. She pressed her bare hands against the boards, feeling for any that flexed wrong, any that gave a little under her weight. She found nothing. She moved to the bookshelves. She took down volumes one at a time and tilted them toward the light. She checked behind them. She tapped the back panels for hollow spots. She moved to the kitchen cabinets. Empty. She moved to the bedroom. She lifted the mattress. She checked the closet. Nothing. The afternoon wore on. The sun moved across the floor in long pale stripes. Her stomach growled. She ignored it. She went back to the main room and stood in front of the great stone fireplace, and she put her hands on her hips, and she stared at it, and she breathed. Her grandfather had loved that fireplace. He had hauled every one of those river stones up from the creek himself one summer when she was a little girl. She remembered him standing in the cold water in his rolled-up canvas pants, picking up rocks and weighing them in his hands, choosing. Stones remember things, Adeline. You just have to know how to ask them. She knelt on the hearth. She ran her fingers along the mortar between the stones. She pressed each one gently, looking for any that moved. None did. She sat back on her heels. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. She looked up at the mantel, and she saw it. The wolf, the carving she had passed 100 times today without registering. The largest figure in her grandfather's panorama. Its head lifted, its body powerful and patient. Its eye was a hole. A perfect, deep, round hole drilled clean into the wood. Every other carved animal on that mantel had eyes. The buck had eyes. The bear had eyes. The owl had 2 great staring eyes. But the wolf had only a darkness where its eyes should have been. Adeline stood up very slowly. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and she drew out the rusted iron key her father had thrown at her feet 18 hours and a lifetime ago. She looked at the key. She looked at the wolf. She lifted the key with both hands because for some reason her hands had begun to tremble again, and she fitted the long shaft into the wolf's empty eye. It slid in. It seated itself. It stopped with the soft, satisfying click of a thing that had been waiting a long time to be turned. She held her breath. She turned the key to the right. For one heartbeat, nothing. And then deep inside the stone of the fireplace, something moved. She heard it more than she felt it. A heavy mechanical sound far below the hearth. A bolt drawing back. A counterweight settling. The right-hand section of the great stone fireplace shuddered. Dust rained down from the ceiling beams. Mortar cracked at the seams between certain stones. Seams she now saw with her heart in her throat had been cut precisely deliberately decades ago. The whole right wall of the hearth, almost 5 feet of stonework, swung slowly inward on hidden steel hinges. Cold air poured out of the opening. It smelled of concrete and of clean machine oil and of something faintly electrical. Beyond the opening, a narrow staircase led down into the dark. The walls of the staircase were not log. They were not stone. They were poured concrete, smooth and gray, the kind of concrete a man builds when he intends to keep something or to hide something for a very long time. A thin red light blinked once far below. Then again, Adeline Bennett, 18 years old, stripped of her name and her fortune and her family in a single morning, stood at the threshold of a doorway her grandfather had built into the bones of a mountain. She drew the key out of the wolf's eye and slid it back into her pocket. She picked up the kerosene lamp from the kitchen table. She lit it with hands that would not stop shaking, and she did not try to make them stop because she understood now that the shaking was not fear. It was something her grandfather had been waiting 18 years for her to feel. She stepped onto the first concrete stair and she began to descend. The staircase went down farther than it had any right to. Adeline counted the steps as she descended because counting was something her grandfather had taught her to do when fear came up from beneath the ribs. Count anything he had once told her on a small boat in heavy weather. Count waves. Count breaths. Count the rivets on the hull. Fear is a fast thing. Counting is a slow thing. Slow always wins. She counted 28 steps. The kerosene lamp threw her shadow long against the smooth concrete walls. The air grew colder as she went down. It also grew drier. She could feel that even through the wool of her sweater. Somewhere down here, machines were working very quietly to keep the air a particular way. At the bottom of the staircase, she stopped. She lifted the lamp. The bunker was not what a bunker is supposed to be. It was not damp. It was not crumbling. It was not a hole in the ground stocked with canned beans and a folding cot. It was a room, a long, low, beautifully built room with poured concrete walls, a polished concrete floor, and a steel beam ceiling that had been dressed in pale pine boards to soften the look of it. A bank of dehumidifiers ran in the far corner, humming so softly she had to hold her breath to hear them. A row of LED ceiling fixtures glowed at half intensity, set on some kind of motion sensor, brightening as she stepped further in. Along one wall stood a server rack the size of a wardrobe, its faceplates winking with small green and amber lights. A heavy black cable ran from the rack into the wall where she could see through a thick glass panel a sealed battery bank fed by what looked like a buried solar array. Her grandfather had built a vault under his fishing cabin. And powered it off the grid, and he had kept it running for the 2 years since his own death. Adeline took 2 more steps into the room, and then she stopped because she had finally seen the rest of it. Along the back wall, 10 wooden pallets had been laid in 2 careful rows. On the pallets sat dozens upon dozens of olive green canvas bags, sturdy, heavy, each one cinched with a brass grommet. One bag had tipped, and from its open mouth, a small slide of metal had spilled across the floor. She knelt down. She picked up one of the coins. It was warm in her hand from the lamplight. The face of it showed a man on horseback, an old Boer man, wide-brimmed hat tilted forward. The reverse showed a springbok in mid-leap, South African Krugerrand, 1 troy ounce of pure gold. She picked up another, and another. She held 3 coins in her palm, and the weight of them told her what her mind was still trying to refuse. There were not dozens of these coins, there were thousands. There was, by the most conservative arithmetic she could do in her head, somewhere between $5 and $8 million in untraceable physical gold sitting on those pallets. Her grandfather had not been a man of inherited wealth. He had been a Navy captain, then a small business owner, then a CEO who had walked away from his company at the height of its value, leaving the running of it to his only son. He had walked away with this. He had walked away with this, and he had buried it under a mountain in upstate New York, and he had told no one. Adeline set the coins gently back into the open bag. She rose. She turned in a slow circle. Her lamp caught the edge of a steel drafting table set against the third wall. She crossed to it. The drafting table was covered in papers. It was not covered the way a messy desk is covered. It was covered the way an investigation is covered. Every paper on it had been laid out with a kind of careful purpose. Maps, manifests, bank statements, high-resolution photographs printed on glossy stock. A heavy leather ledger, bound in cracked black hide, sat dead center. Above the table, mounted on the concrete wall, was a corkboard nearly 6 feet wide. The corkboard was the worst thing. The corkboard was the thing her grandfather had spent the better part of a decade building. In its center, pinned with 4 red tacks, was an 8x10 color photograph of her father. Garrett Bennett in a tailored suit standing on a private dock, shaking the hand of a man Adeline did not recognize. The other man wore aviator sunglasses and a linen jacket and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Beneath the photograph, her grandfather had written in red marker, in his precise sailor's handwriting, 2 lines. Garrett Bennett, President Bennett Maritime Logistics. Meeting with Mikhail Volya, sanctioned arms broker, Limassol, Cyprus. A heavy red X had been drawn through her father's smiling face. Around the central photograph, dozens of other photographs and documents fanned outward like the rays of a black sun. Cargo manifests, customs forms from Antwerp, bank wire confirmations from accounts in Nicosia, in Georgetown, and Vaduz. Surveillance shots taken with a long lens of Bennett shipping containers being unloaded by men in unmarked uniforms in places Adeline could not name. Each item had been labeled. Each item had been dated. Each item had been cross-referenced to others by colored thread that ran from pin to pin in patient, deliberate webs. The corkboard was not a wall of evidence. The corkboard was an indictment. Adeline stepped back from it. Her hand found the edge of the drafting table. She gripped it to steady herself. She looked down. Beside the heavy leather ledger lay a smaller book. Its cover was hand-tooled brown leather, and across the front of it, her grandfather had embossed 3 words in plain gold leaf. For Adeline, open. She reached for it with both hands. She was not 18 anymore. She was not 6. She was the small girl on the porch, and she was the woman in the bunker. And she was every age she had ever been with her grandfather all at once. She opened the book. The first page was a letter, written in the neat, slightly slanted handwriting that had filled the margins of every birthday card she had ever received. Adeline, if you are reading this, then you are 18, and you have found the wolf's eye, and you have come down the stair I built for you. I am sorry. I am sorry that the world I leave you is the world that this letter requires. I tried, sweetheart. I tried for years to bring it down without you. I could not. Your father is not the man he pretends to be. The company I built and gave him has been turned into something I do not have the words for. He moves weapons, Adeline, real weapons, the kind that end villages. He moves them under the flags of legitimate cargo, and he protects the routes with bribery so deep that I cannot pull a thread without bringing the whole house down on top of me. I am one old man. I cannot reach high enough, but I can reach you. I have always been able to reach you. The gold on those pallets is yours. Use it to live. Use it to run. Use it if you have to disappear forever. I will not blame you for that. No grandfather would. The papers on this table are also yours. They are the canvas, sweetheart. They are the ugly truth under the painted surface. If you choose to use them, they will burn his empire to the ground, and they will burn many other empires with it, and the men who built those empires will come for you very fast and very hard. I will not lie to you about that. I can only tell you what I told you on the porch when you were small. Honor before blood. I love you. I have loved you since the morning your mother handed you to me, And I will love you across whatever distance there is between this letter and your eyes, Grandpa Wynne. Adeline read the letter twice. Then she pressed the open book against her chest, and she sat down on the cold concrete floor. And for a little while, she did not think about gold, or about empires, or about what came next. For a little while, she only thought about her grandfather. When she was done, she wiped her face and she stood up. She set the leather book down beside the ledger. She drew her sleeve across her eyes once more, and she went to work. She did not know how much time she had. She knew from Silas Tobin's words on the porch that men with an excavator were coming back to this property on Tuesday. She knew from her father's behavior in the study that he had handed her this cabin only because he was confident there was nothing in it she would survive long enough to use. He had been wrong about the cabin. He had not yet been proven wrong about the surviving. She crossed to the server rack. A single computer terminal was wired into it, sitting on a small steel desk, its monitor dark. She found the power switch on the side of the keyboard and flicked it up. The screen woke. A green cursor blinked in the center of a black field. 3 words sat above it. Identify the canvas. Adeline let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Of course. She sat down in the chair. The chair was old, but it was good, the kind of high-backed office chair a Navy man buys when he intends to spend many quiet years in it. She placed her fingers on the keys. The canvas, the thing beneath the paint, the true name of the thing. Her first guess was a date. She typed her mother's death day, September 12th, 2013, the day the world had cracked open under her 6-year-old feet and never quite fit back together again. The screen flashed red. Access denied. 2 attempts remaining. Her stomach tightened. She lifted her fingers from the keys. She closed her eyes. She made herself breathe. The canvas was not a date. The canvas was the foundation, the thing the surface was built on. What was the foundation of every lie her father had ever told Bennett Maritime Logistics? The company her grandfather had built, the company her father had hijacked, the thing under the paint of all those tailored suits, in quiet voices and offshore accounts. She typed, 1978 Providence, the year of the founding, the name of the first ship. The screen went black for 1 terrible second. Then it flooded with blue. A directory tree blossomed across the monitor. Folders within folders within folders, opening like the rooms of a great strange house. At the top of the tree, in white capital letters, sat a single label. The Carthage Files. Adeline began to read. She read for the better part of 2 hours. She read shipping manifests for crates labeled as agricultural threshing components that had been intercepted, weighed, and photographed by a private investigator her grandfather had retained out of Hamburg. The crates had been opened. Inside the crates were not threshing components. Inside the crates were the disassembled barrel assemblies in trigger groups of military-grade automatic rifles packed in rubberized foam meant to be reassembled at destination. She read internal Bennett Maritime emails her grandfather had somehow obtained, in which her father instructed his head of operations to route specific cargo containers through Antwerp and Constanta on a schedule that avoided certain customs inspectors and coincided with certain port shifts. She read the wire records of payments made from Bennett-controlled shell companies to private accounts held by 2 sitting United States senators on the Maritime Commerce Subcommittee. The amounts were not small. The pattern was monthly. The dates aligned with 3 separate pieces of legislation that had quietly weakened export controls on dual-use technology. She read about Project Chimera, about civilian-grade automotive parts that were not civilian-grade automotive parts, about drone sub-assemblies with thermal imaging modules. She read about the man in the photograph above the desk, Mikhail Volya, about the militias he had armed, about what those militias had done in places her geography teacher had never had occasion to mention. She read until her eyes burned. When she finally pushed back from the desk, she understood several things she had not understood before. She understood why her father had handed her this cabin. She understood why he had hired a demolition crew before she had ever set foot on the property. And she understood why 2 years ago her grandfather had died of what the family doctor had called a sudden heart attack in his own bed, alone a week before he had been scheduled to fly down to Washington to meet with a federal investigator. Her hand went to the small steel drawer of the desk. She pulled it open. Inside, sitting in a foam-lined cradle, was a heavy rubberized data drive, a Kingston iron key. Her grandfather had labeled the foam beneath it with a small piece of masking tape, and on the masking tape he had written in pencil, "Take it all." Adeline plugged the drive into the terminal. She selected the master directory. She initiated a full transfer. A progress bar appeared. Estimated time 14 minutes. She watched the first percentages tick upward. 1, 2, 3. And that was when the dogs began to bark. She heard it through the walls. Distant, the deep belling of a hound somewhere up the ridge, picking up a scent. She looked at the bank of small monitors mounted above the server rack, which she had not even noticed until that moment. There were 6 of them. Each one showed a black and white feed from a hidden camera. A camera in the cabin's eaves, a camera in a birdhouse on a pine, a camera lens disguised as a knot in a fence post. Her grandfather had wired this property with the same eyes the United States Navy had once used to watch the coast of Murmansk. On screen 1, a black Cadillac Escalade was rolling slowly up the gravel drive, its headlights off in the daylight. Adeline's breath stopped in her throat. The Escalade pulled in beside her Subaru and parked. 4 doors open. 4 men stepped out. 3 of them she did not recognize. They wore dark tactical clothing, plate carriers under their jackets. They moved with a quiet, professional economy that had nothing to do with construction crews from Albany. The 4th man she recognized, Holden Voss, Vice President of Risk Management at Bennett Maritime. The man who showed up at her father's holiday parties wearing a Patek Philippe and a thin small, and who never drank and who never sat down. The man whose actual function in the company had never quite been explained at the dinner table. She knew now what his function was. Holden Voss drew a suppressed pistol from beneath his jacket. He gestured. 2 of his men split off and circled the cabin. The 3rd followed him to the porch. On the upstairs feed, Adeline watched Holden Voss try the front door. She had locked it behind her. He took 1 step back, lifted a boot, and drove it into the door. The reinforced steel core did not give. He frowned. He stepped back further. He spoke to the man behind him. The man unslung a heavy black case from his shoulder and began assembling something that Adeline, who had watched too many movies in her life and not enough in this moment, did not at first recognize as a battering ram. She looked at the progress bar on the terminal, 23%. She looked back at the screens, and then her eyes caught on the lower right monitor, and her heart stopped a second time because the lower right monitor showed Silas Tobin. Silas was on his porch 3 miles down the ridge in his red flannel shirt with an old lever-action rifle across his knee. He was not looking at the cabin. He was looking up the ridge toward the place where the gravel road bent through the pines. He had heard the Escalade. He stood up. He set the rifle butt down on the boards of his porch like a walking stick. And then he climbed into his old red Ford and he started the engine. "No," Adeline whispered to the screen. "No, Mr. Tobin, don't." But the man on the screen could not hear her, and even if he could have, Adeline knew with a terrible certainty that he would not have listened. She turned away from the monitors. She moved fast. She yanked her duffel bag down from where she had dropped it at the top of the stair. She tipped it out onto the floor. Her clothes spilled across the concrete. She knelt down beside the open canvas bag of Krugerrands, and she scooped coins by the double handful, dropping them into the duffel until the bag would hold no more without splitting at the seams. 40 pounds, maybe 50, heavy enough to slow her, not heavy enough to catch her. She grabbed Wendell's leather ledger. She grabbed the smaller book with her own name on it. She pulled the iron key from the terminal at 68%, and she shoved everything down into the bag on top of the gold. She was zipping the duffel when the first impact hit the front door of the cabin upstairs. The sound came down the stair like distant artillery. Crack. She straightened. She looked around the bunker. Her grandfather had been a Navy captain, a man who had spent his adult life on vessels where the question was never if a thing could go wrong, but when. A man who, if he built a sealed room in the side of a mountain, would not build it with one door. She turned in a circle. The server rack. She crossed to it. Behind it, her hand brushed against bundled Ethernet cables. Behind the cables, set into the back wall of the bunker, was a circular steel hatch, a wheel at its center, painted the same gray as the concrete so that even with the LED lights up to full, she had not seen it on her first sweep. Crack, crack. The door upstairs would not hold forever. Even Wendell Bennett had not built a door that could hold forever. She set her bag at the foot of the hatch. She gripped the wheel with both hands. She threw her shoulder into it. The wheel did not move. She set her feet. She tried again. Years of rust on the spindle, years of patient corrosion. She thought of her grandfather standing in Coal Creek water, choosing stones. She thought of his hands. She thought of the 2 words he had written in the front of the leather book. Honor before blood. The wheel turned. It turned a 1/4 inch, then a full inch. Then it broke its seal with a metallic groan that she felt through her teeth, and the hatch swung outward into a low corrugated tunnel that smelled of wet clay and old iron. Above her, somewhere in the cabin upstairs, a heavy thump shook dust down from the ceiling beams of the bunker. She heard a man shout, "There it is! Sledgehammers on the hearth! Now!" She did not stop to understand what they had found. She shoved the duffel into the tunnel and then she crawled in after it on her hands and knees and she pulled the hatch shut behind her. The tunnel was narrow. The tunnel was very narrow. Her shoulders brushed the corrugated metal on both sides. Her elbows scraped, her knees through the denim, took the cold of the steel and gave it back as bruising. The duffel bag of gold dragged on a strap looped around her wrist, banged against her hip with every shove forward. She could not see anything. The dark in the tunnel was the kind of dark that had texture. She felt her way. She breathed through her nose and counted the way her grandfather had taught her to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Slow always wins. Behind her, very far behind her, now she heard a muffled detonation, a door blowing inward. The echo of it traveled down the tunnel in a low, hollow boom that seemed to push at her back. She crawled faster. She did not know how long she crawled. She knew only that at some point, when her hands had gone numb on the cold metal and her shoulders were on fire and the tendons in her wrists felt like they were beginning to tear, she saw a sliver of pale gray ahead of her. Daylight, a grate. She reached it. She pressed her palms against it and she pushed. It did not give. She pushed again. Pine needles and earth had silted up against the outside of it. She braced her back against the top of the tunnel and got both legs into it, and she kicked. The grate gave with a sound like an old man's complaint. She tumbled out into the bright, cold air of the forest floor. She was on her hands and knees in moss. The grate was concealed inside a thicket of blackberry canes on the embankment above Hollow Creek, 200 yards from the cabin. Above her, somewhere up the slope, a man was shouting. Below her, the creek ran fast and loud over its rocks. She picked up the duffel bag and she ran. She ran along the creek downstream because the creek would mask her footsteps and because water did not hold a scent. She ran with the bag thumping against her back. She ran with her lungs on fire. She ran until the shouting had faded behind her, and then she ran further because her grandfather had told her once on a winter beach in Connecticut that the difference between escape and capture was usually the last 100 yards a person did not think they had in them. She had 100 yards. She had 200. She had the rest of her life if she could just keep her feet moving. She stopped, finally doubled over, the hands on her knees, half a mile downstream from where she had come out of the tunnel. The forest was very quiet around her. Only the creek, only her own ragged breathing. It was then that she heard the crack. A single distant report. Sharp, Flat, the unmistakable sound of a rifle. Then another. Then a long, terrible silence. Adeline stood very still with her hand pressed against the cold bark of a maple, and she understood the way you understand a thing in your bones before your mind catches up what had just happened up the ridge. Silas Tobin had not gone home. Silas Tobin had bought her time. She closed her eyes. She allowed herself for one breath to lower her head. Then she lifted it. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up her bag. She kept moving. She did not stop until she found her car. The Subaru was where she had left it, on a logging spur, half a mile from the cabin, hidden in a cluster of young pines. The Escalade men had not seen it. They had come down the main drive. She had parked in the way her grandfather had once taught her to park, with the nose pointed out. She threw the duffel into the passenger seat. She climbed in. She started the engine on the second try. She did not turn on the headlights until she had driven 3 miles down an old fire road. By nightfall, she was in Syracuse. The pawn shop sat in a strip mall on the edge of the city between a check-cashing place and a closed nail salon. Iron bars on the windows. A neon sign that said gold and silver, and another that said we buy guns. Adeline pulled her hood up before she got out of the car. The man behind the bulletproof glass barely looked at her. She slid 2 Krugerrands through the steel slot. Cash, she said. Small bills, no questions. He picked up a jeweler's loop. He examined the coins for what could not have been more than 10 seconds. His eyebrows lifted very slightly. 3,000, he said. For the pair. Take it or leave it. It was robbery. The coins were worth 4 times that on any honest market. But honest markets had paper trails, and Adeline did not have the luxury of paper trails anymore. Take it, she said. He counted out a stack of 20s without ever quite making eye contact with her, and when she walked out of the shop with $3,000 in cash stuffed into the inside pocket of her jacket, she understood that she had just become the kind of person other people did not want to look at directly. She bought a prepaid cell phone at a gas station. She bought a refurbished laptop at an electronics store on Erie Boulevard, paying cash, giving the clerk a name that was not her own. She drove to a roadside motel called the Pinecrest, paid for 1 night in cash, and locked herself inside a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial carpet cleaner. She sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress. She turned on the laptop. She plugged in the Kingston drive. The drive was 68% of what it should have been. 68% of the Carthage files. 68% of the case her grandfather had spent the better part of a decade building. It was enough. She knew it was enough, but she also knew, looking at the small gray rectangle on the screen, that she could not do this alone. She was 18 years old. She was wanted somehow by men who could afford to fly Cadillacs into national forests. She had no last name she could safely use. She had no lawyer she could trust. She had no platform. She needed someone with a microphone bigger than her enemies. She opened the laptop's web browser. She spent the next 4 hours reading. She read about national security journalists. She read about reporters who had broken stories on military contractors and had not died doing it. She read editorial bylines in publications that her father in his study had taught her to call dishonest, and she understood now finally why he had taught her that. One name kept rising back to the surface: Declan Riley, senior investigative correspondent for The Sentinel, Pulitzer winner 6 years ago for a series on offshore arms financing. Known in his field for 2 things: an obsessive personal security regime and a refusal in 17 years of reporting to ever name a source. He worked out of a small bureau office in Washington, D.C. He was, according to one profile, 52 years old and unmarried and famously hard to scare. Adeline opened an encrypted email client. She wrote a single message: I have the Carthage files. Bennett Maritime Logistics is a front for international weapons trafficking. I am the granddaughter of the man who built the company. I am the daughter of the man who has destroyed it. I will be at 30th Street Station in Philadelphia tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Bring a 1998 issue of Wired magazine and hold it where I can see it. She attached a single redacted invoice from the Antwerp shipments. She hit send. The reply came in 9 minutes. I'll be there. DR. She slept 4 hours that night. She dreamed of Silas Tobin standing on his porch in the morning sun, lifting his cap to her one more time. When she woke, it was still dark. She drove south. The vaulted ceilings of 30th Street Station rose like the inside of a cathedral above the morning rush. Light came down through the great arched windows and long slanted bars. The marble floor echoed with the sound of 1,000 pairs of shoes. Adeline sat at a small round table near a coffee kiosk, cradling a cup she had no intention of drinking. She wore a knit cap pulled low over her hair. She had not slept well. Her hands were steadier than she would have expected. She saw him before he saw her. He was a tall, slightly stooped man in a rumpled tweed jacket, thin wire-rimmed glasses, hair gone gray at the temples. He carried a battered leather satchel over one shoulder, and in his right hand he held a magazine, the cover glossy and dated and unmistakable. Wired, August 1998. The cover image was a graphic about something called the Millennium Bug. He moved through the crowd without seeming to. He looked at no one. He looked at everyone. Adeline stood up. She walked past him on her way to the trash can. As she passed, she dropped a folded napkin onto his table. The napkin had 2 lines on it. Quiet car, train 84, south to Wilmington. 20 minutes later, the Amtrak Northeast Regional pulled out of 30th Street Station, and Adeline Bennett sat in a forward-facing window seat of the quiet car, and across the small table from her sat Declan Riley. He did not speak until the train had crossed the Schuylkill. He laid the magazine flat on the table between them. He folded his hands on top of it. He looked at her over the rims of his glasses with an expression that was not warm and was not cold, only patient the way a doctor's expression is patient. "You're Garrett Bennett's daughter," he said quietly. "Yes." "The girl on the news." "What news?" He looked at her a moment longer. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and brought out his phone, and he turned the screen toward her. A breaking news banner ran across the bottom of a CNN broadcast. The headline read, "Nationwide Manhunt Heiress Wanted in Adirondack Cabin Bombing Murder of Neighbor." In the corner of the screen, her own face lifted from a school portrait stared out at her over the words "armed and dangerous." The walls of the train car seemed very briefly to lean inward. Adeline made herself breathe. She understood very calmly that her stepmother had not just sent a demolition crew and a fixer. Her stepmother had made the Barton federal government her stepmother's enforcement arm. "Mr. Riley," she said, her voice was level. She was proud of that. "I did not bomb that cabin. I did not kill Silas Tobin. They killed him because he tried to warn me. Whoever is telling you that story is the same person who needs a story to be told." Declan Riley studied her face for a long, silent moment. Then he reached across the table and slid the laptop she had set there toward himself. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She showed him for the next hour and 40 minutes while the train ran south through Delaware and on into Maryland, while the marshes flickered past the window, and the pale sun climbed, and the conductor came through twice and never stopped at their seats. She showed him the manifest. She showed him the photographs. She showed him the wire transfers. She showed him Mikhail Volya in his linen jacket and the senators on the subcommittee in Project Chimera. The color went out of Declan Riley's face by slow degrees. When she was done, he sat back in his seat. He took off his glasses. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "My God," he said softly. "Your grandfather, he was working this for the better part of a decade, alone. He didn't have anyone he could trust. He had me." Declan Riley looked up. His eyes were red. "He just never told me." Adeline went very still. "What?" He did not answer her right away. He reached into his satchel. He brought out a small, portable hard drive of his own. He plugged it into the side of her laptop. He opened a directory she had not seen of Bennett-controlled shell companies, and he began to cross-reference account numbers against something on his own drive. After a moment, his finger slowed. "Adeline," he said, "look at this." She leaned forward. He had pulled up a routing tree for the Cayman Islands holding companies. The trail led through 3 layers of shells to a master account at a private bank in Vaduz, Liechtenstein. The master account was held by an entity called Crawford Holdings. My grandfather had this in his files, Adeline said. The Crawford accounts. He thought they were Dad's offshore vehicles. Declan Riley shook his head slowly. They aren't. He pointed at a small line of metadata on the screen, a signatory authority field. Your father is listed here, yes, but he is listed as a secondary signatory. The primary account holder is the named principal of Crawford Holdings. Look at the name. She looked. She read the name. She read it a second time. The world tilted very gently around her, the way a small boat tilts when a long swell passes beneath it. Lenora M. Crawford. That's my stepmother, Adeline said. The words came out small. That's her maiden name? Yeah, my father. Psh. Your father is not the architect of this, Adeline. Declan Riley's voice was quiet, but it had a weight to it that she felt in her chest. Your father is a signatory. Your father is the public face. Your father is the man who shakes hands with Mikhail Volya at private docks in Cyprus. But he does not control the money. The money was never his. He turned the laptop a few degrees so that she could see the screen better. He scrolled through years of wire transfers. The pattern was clean once you knew to look for it. The capital flowed in one direction. The instructions flowed in another. And at the top of the food chain, calm and patient, sat a single name. Your stepmother, Declan said, was not married into this empire. Your stepmother built this empire. She married your father 6 months after your mother's death because she needed an American shipping network with an unimpeachable family name attached to it. Your father has been her instrument. He does not even know it. Or if he knows it, he has stopped admitting it to himself. Adeline thought of Lenora Crawford Bennett by the fireplace in the study glass of Pinot Noir, in her hands smiling that small bright smile. She thought of her father's quiet voice. Get out of my house. She thought of how that voice had cracked just once when she had spoken her mother's name. He disowned me, she said slowly, because he wanted me out of the blast radius. Declan looked at her. He nodded once gravely. It is the only theory that fits the evidence. He couldn't stop her from sending men after me. He could only get me out of the house first. Yes, Adeline sat back. She looked out the window. The marshes had given way to industrial yards. A long oil tanker sat low in a brown estuary. Gulls wheeled above it. She thought of her mother who had died in a single-car crash on a curved stretch of road outside New Canaan when Adeline was 6 years old. The brakes, the report had said, had simply failed. The car had been only 2 months old. The investigator had used the phrase manufacturing defect. She thought of her stepmother, who had moved into the house 6 months later. She thought of the look that had passed between her father and his new wife, the first time Adeline had been asked at age 7 to call this woman Mom. The look had been very brief. She had not understood it at the time. She understood it now. Mr. Riley, Adeline said very quietly, I need you to look at one more thing. She typed a name into the directory's internal search tool. Cassandra Bennett, her mother's name. A folder opened that she had not seen before. A folder her grandfather had labeled simply in lowercase for when she's ready. Her hands began to shake again. She did not try to stop them. She clicked the folder open. And as the train rolled south toward a country that an hour ago she had thought she still belonged to, Adeline Bennett began to read what her grandfather had spent years assembling about the woman she had loved most in the world and the woman who had taken her place. The folder opened slowly. Inside it, her grandfather had laid out the death of Cassandra Bennett the way a careful man lays out a body for burial. Each document in its place, each photograph in its order. The dignity of the work was the dignity of a sailor preparing a comrade for the sea. The first document was the original accident report from the Connecticut State Police. A single vehicle collision on Route 124, 2 miles north of New Canaan, on a clear afternoon in September of 2013. The report listed the cause as catastrophic brake failure on a vehicle that was at the time of the crash 63 days old. The second document was a copy of the dealership's service record. Cassandra Bennett had brought the car in for an unscheduled inspection 9 days before her death. She had reported in her own handwriting on the intake form, intermittent soft pedal, faint odor of fluid, possible leak. The dealership had inspected the vehicle. The dealership had pronounced the brakes fully operational. The dealership had not retained the technician's notes. The third document was a private investigator's report commissioned by Wendell Bennett 3 years after his daughter-in-law's funeral, when grief had finally given way to something colder. The investigator had tracked down the technician. The technician had been laid off from the dealership 6 weeks after Cassandra's death. The technician had moved to Florida. The technician, when found in a small house outside of Ocala by a man with a quiet voice and a full envelope of cash, had said only this. He had said that on the day Cassandra Bennett had brought her car in, he had been pulled off the job by a man he did not know, a man who had spoken to him by name in the parking lot, a man who had given him an envelope thicker than the one in the investigator's hand and had told him to go home for the day. When the technician had come back the next morning, the car had already been signed off by a signature that was not his, and Mrs. Bennett had been called and told everything was fine. Adeline read the report. She read it twice. She did not cry. She had cried already today in a tunnel under a mountain. The well had not refilled yet. She turned the laptop a few degrees so that Declan Riley could see. "My mother knew," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. "She brought the car in. She knew something was wrong. They turned her away." Declan read in silence. When he reached the bottom of the page, he closed his eyes for a long moment. "Your grandfather," he said. "He found this. He found this, and he kept it. For how long? Look at the date on the report." Declan looked. The investigator's report had been filed 9 years ago. "She has been in your father's house for 12 years, Declan said very softly. "Almost since the funeral. She came in 6 months after my mother died. Your grandfather knew within 3 years. Yes. And he never told your father." Adeline thought about that. She thought about the man at the great oak desk in the study, with his charcoal suit and his cufflinks and his quiet voice. She thought about his hand the night before signing away her name as if signing a freight invoice. She thought about Wendell Bennett, who had loved his son, who had built his son a company, and who had looked at his son one day and decided that his son could no longer be told the truth. "He didn't tell my father," Adeline said, "because he wasn't sure my father didn't already know." Declan Riley did not answer. He did not need to. The train rolled on. Outside the window, the gray water of the Chesapeake passed slowly. Adeline watched a flight of geese rise from a marsh and bank northward in a ragged line. Declan's phone buzzed once on the table. He picked it up. He read the screen. The color that had only just begun to return to his face went out of it again. "Adeline," he said, "we are getting off this train." "What?" He turned the screen toward her. A second alert from a colleague at the Sentinel. 3 lines. Federal warrant just upgraded. Domestic terrorism statute. They are pulling Amtrak manifests. Get off at the next stop. Do it now. Adeline closed the laptop. She slid it into her bag. She zipped it. The train was already slowing. The conductor's voice came through the speaker announcing Wilmington. They stood up together. They walked not too fast toward the rear of the car. Declan kept one hand near the small of his back where Adeline had not previously noticed the slight outline of something under his jacket, and now did. The train stopped. They stepped down onto the platform with the rest of the disembarking passengers, and Declan steered her not toward the station building, but toward a service door at the far end of the platform, and through the service door into a maintenance corridor, and through the maintenance corridor out onto a loading dock behind the station, where a battered white van with the magnetic logo of a flower delivery service sat idling. The driver, a short woman in her 40s with a face that had been awake for several days, looked Declan up and down. You're late, she said. I'm alive, Declan said. Drive. The factory was on the north side of Philadelphia in a neighborhood the city had stopped pretending it was going to redevelop. 12 stories of red brick, most of the windows broken. The loading dock door rolled up just enough for the van to slide under, then rolled down again behind them. The driver did not get out. She did not say goodbye. She backed the van out the way they had come and was gone. Inside the factory was a vast open space of rusted machinery and pigeon droppings and shafts of pale light coming down through the broken skylights overhead. Their footsteps echoed against the brick. Declan led her up a set of iron stairs to a foreman's office on a mezzanine. The office had a desk, 2 folding chairs, a steel cot in the corner, with a folded blanket on it and a black hard-shell case on the floor that he opened to reveal a ruggedized field laptop, a satellite uplink, and a small stack of unmarked drives. He set up quickly. He worked the way Adeline's grandfather had once worked on the deck of a small boat in heavy weather. Calm hands, no wasted motion. What are you doing? She asked. I am uploading every byte you brought me, he said, to 412 newsrooms, advocacy organizations, and federal investigative offices simultaneously. The package will deploy to all of them at the same instant. It cannot be killed by killing one of us. It cannot be killed by killing 2 of us. The only way to stop it now is to find every recipient on the list in 14 minutes and kill them all. He glanced up at her. They will not be able to do that. 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Once the bar moves, we are going to be the loudest thing on the eastern seaboard. Until the bar moves, we are 2 people in an empty factory, and the only thing standing between us and them is whether they figured out where the van went. He hit a key. The progress bar appeared. It began to crawl. 1%, 2. Adeline walked to the cracked window of the foreman's office and looked down into the cavernous floor of the factory below. Pigeons fluttered in the rafters. A pale square of sunlight lay across an overturned wooden crate. 3%. She thought about Silas Tobin on his porch. She thought about her mother on a curved road in Connecticut. She thought about her grandfather on the deck of the Providence, 25 years old, learning the cold. 5%. A car door slammed somewhere outside the factory. Adeline went still. Declan Riley did not look up from the keyboard, but his right hand drifted casually to the small of his back, and when it came back into view, it was holding a compact silver revolver, which he set on the desk beside the laptop without ceremony. Stay back from the window, he said quietly. She stepped back. The footsteps came up the iron stairs slowly. 3 sets. Heavy. Professional. Not the rushed footsteps of men who thought they were going to be surprised. The door of the foreman's office opened. Holden Voss stepped through it. He looked exactly as he had looked on the surveillance feed in the bunker. Tactical clothing, a suppressed pistol in his right hand held low and loose, his face the same blank professional mask. 2 men flanked him in the doorway, their own weapons up the small red dots of laser sights painting the wall above the desk. Mr. Riley, Holden Voss said, his voice was calm. Step away from the laptop. Declan Riley did not move. It's a dead man's switch, he said. If I cancel the upload, the package fragments and emails itself to 1,000 random addresses in the next 90 seconds. You shoot me, the same thing happens. You shoot her, the same thing happens. There is no version of the next 60 seconds where this story does not get out. Holden Voss looked at him for a long moment. He smiled very slightly. I have heard better bluffs, he said, from better men. Take him. One of the flanking men shifted his weight to fire. Wait! Adeline's voice cut through the room. She had not raised it. She had not had to. Holden Voss turned his eyes to her. She walked very slowly around the side of the desk. She put herself between the doorway and Declan Riley. She felt a laser dot find her chest and rest there. She did not look down at it. Mr. Voss, she said. Holden, you don't know who you work for. He almost laughed. I work for your father, Adeline. No, she said. You don't. He waited. She reached slowly down to the keyboard. She did not look away from his face. She tapped a single key. The progress bar on the screen jumped to 30%. Beside it, the directory tree she had been reading on the train opened out in plain view. The folder labeled Crawford Holdings glowed at the top. "Look at the screen," Adeline said. Holden Voss glanced, just for an instant, long enough. "The signatory authority on every wire transfer that has ever landed in your offshore retirement account," she said, "is not Garrett Bennett. The signatory authority is a woman whose maiden name is Crawford. My stepmother, Lenora, the woman you have been taking your real orders from for as long as you have been working at my father's company." Holden Voss said nothing. "Now look at the second screen," Adeline said. She tapped another key. A second window opened. A live banking feed, a Swiss numbered account. The balance read 0. The transaction history showed a single line item time-stamped 56 minutes earlier. "Outgoing wire full balance. Destination flagged." The room was very quiet. The pigeons in the rafters of the factory below fluttered and were still. "That is your account," Adeline said, "isn't it?" Holden Voss did not answer. He did not have to. She watched his face. There was no expression on it. There was something better than an expression. There was the absence of one. The look of a man whose 30-year picture of the world had just had a corner of it lifted and whose mind was rapidly, quietly, mercilessly redrawing itself. "She emptied it an hour ago," Adeline said. "The same hour your team rolled up the gravel road to my grandfather's cabin. She didn't wait for you to finish the job. She moved your money the moment we escaped that bunker. Because she knew the moment those files left that property, the empire was over. And she is cleaning house." She tilted her head very slightly toward the doorway. "You are not the executioner, Mr. Voss. You are the loose end." The two flanking men's eyes flickered very briefly sideways, toward their commander, toward the screen, toward each other. It was the smallest tell in the world, but it was a tell. Holden Voss reached slowly into the inner pocket of his jacket. He drew out a sleek black satellite phone. He thumbed a speed dial entry. He held the phone to his ear. He waited. 10 seconds. 12. "The number you have reached," a flat synthetic voice said into the silent room, just loud enough for Adeline to hear it, "is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." Holden Voss lowered the phone. He looked at it. He looked at his men. He looked at Adeline Bennett, 18 years old, standing between him and the laptop, with no weapon, no protection, nothing in her hands but the truth her grandfather had spent years putting into her keeping. For the first time since he had walked into the foreman's office, his shoulders moved. A small breath, a long one out. He holstered his pistol. "Fall back," he said. His men hesitated. "I said fall back," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. There was something in it now that Adeline understood with a strange, small spark of pity. Was the voice of a man who had just realized he was going to spend the rest of his life on the wrong side of a hunt. The two men lowered their weapons. Holden Voss turned in the doorway. He looked back at Adeline one last time. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a careful man." "Yes." "Tell whoever finds me," he said, "that I went a long way." He stepped out of the doorway. He went down the iron stairs. The two men followed him. The footsteps faded across the factory floor and out through the loading dock, and a vehicle started up in the alley outside, and the engine sound dwindled into the city and was gone. Behind Adeline, the laptop chimed softly. She turned. The progress bar on the screen had filled. A single line of green text sat beneath it. "Upload complete. Package delivered to 412 endpoints." Declan Riley let out a long breath. He closed his eyes. He set his palms flat on the desk on either side of the keyboard, the way a man steadies himself on the rail of a ship. "It's out," he said. "Yes. It is out and it cannot be put back." "No," he opened his eyes. He looked at her. "Miss Bennett," he said, "we are going to want to be somewhere else when the world finds out where the package came from." She nodded. She picked up her duffel bag. The world found out by sunrise. By sunrise, every major broadcast network in the United States was leading with the same story. By sunrise, the Sentinel had published a 6,000-word lead story under the byline of a journalist named Declan Riley, and the story had been mirrored by prearrangement on the websites of the BBC Le Monde, Der Spiegel, The Guardian, Asahi Shimbun, and the public records pages of 3 federal inspectors general. By sunrise, the FBI had executed a search warrant on the Bennett Maritime Logistics corporate headquarters at One Battery Place in Manhattan. By 8 o'clock, federal agents were carrying servers out of the lobby on hand trucks. By 9, the Treasury Department had announced an asset freeze on 26 shell companies. By 10, Interpol had issued red notices to 4 jurisdictions. At 11 that morning, 2 agents in dark jackets pulled into the circular driveway of the Bennett estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Garrett Bennett walked out of his front door to meet them on the wet flagstones in his shirt sleeves. He did not run. He did not protest. He held out his wrists. The cuffs went on without ceremony. As they walked him to the car, a third agent, a young woman with a steady voice, read him his rights, and Adeline Bennett's father listened to those words with the look of a man who had been waiting for a very long time to finally hear them. Lenora Crawford Bennett almost made it out. Her car arrived at Teterboro Executive Airport at 11:53, just as the corporate jet she had chartered through a third-party logistics company was beginning its taxi check on the private tarmac. Lenora stepped out of the car in a charcoal traveling coat and a pair of dark glasses. She handed her smaller bag to the pilot. She walked toward the air stair. The vehicles came in fast from 3 directions at once. 6 federal agents and 2 officers from the New Jersey State Police converged on the tarmac before she reached the steps. She did not run. She had a sense of theater her husband had never quite mastered. She turned to face them with the dark glasses still on, and she lifted her chin, and she let them put her in cuffs in front of the windows of the chartered jet's cabin, where much later the news cameras would zoom in on a small detail that would lead the evening broadcast. In the inside pocket of Lenora Crawford's traveling coat, the agents found a single rectangular device the size of a deck of cards, a small green LED on its face, a radio frequency module, the kind of detonator a person uses to remotely trigger an industrial demolition charge. A forensics team would later match the unit's frequency signature by serial number to the explosive that had reduced Wendell Bennett's cabin in the Adirondacks to a smoking foundation 18 days earlier. 3 weeks later, in a small private room at the federal detention facility in Lower Manhattan, Adeline Bennett sat across a thick pane of reinforced glass from her stepmother. It was Adeline who had asked for the meeting. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been against it. Her own newly retained counsel had been against it. Declan Riley had been against it. Adeline had told them calmly that she was going. She had told them that there was a thing she needed to know that no transcript and no deposition would ever get out of the woman on the other side of the glass, and that she was not going to live the rest of her life without knowing it. Lenora Crawford was not in handcuffs. She did not need to be. The room was sealed. The door behind her was steel. A guard stood at the far wall with his hands folded behind him. She wore the federal khaki of a pre-trial detainee. Her hair was pulled back in a way that did not flatter her. Her face, without makeup, was older than Adeline had ever seen it. She still smiled. The smile was smaller now, but it was the same smile. "Hello, Adeline." Adeline did not return the greeting. She set a small audio recorder on the metal counter on her side of the glass. She turned it on. She made sure the indicator light was visible to her stepmother through the partition. "I have one question," she said. "Just one. Just one. You can lie to me if you want. We both know the answer doesn't change anything that's going to happen to you. I am just asking because I am the only person left who has the right to ask." Lenora Crawford looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Ask. Did you have my mother killed?" The room was very quiet. A clock somewhere in the wall ticked almost too softly to hear. Lenora Crawford did not blink. "Yes," she said. Adeline did not move. "How?" "You said one question." "How?" Lenora considered the glass for a moment. Then she shrugged a very small shrug as if she had been carrying a small stone in her pocket for a very long time and had finally in this room decided to set it down. A man at the dealership, she said. He was paid to step away from the bay on the morning your mother brought the car in. The brake line had been compromised the night before. Soft pedal at first. The line was designed to give entirely under stress. A long curve, enough speed. Why? Because your father had a global logistics network with an unimpeachable family name, and your mother was beginning to ask questions about freight she should not have been asking questions about. And because I had spent 4 years preparing the ground, and your mother was the last thing standing in it. Adeline let the silence stretch. My grandfather knew, she said. Yes. He knew, and he didn't tell my father. He couldn't be sure your father wasn't already mine. Lenora Crawford tilted her head. The smile faintly was back at the corner of her mouth. He was right to be uncertain. Your father was by then a man who had stopped asking himself certain questions. There is a kind of man who builds a marriage the way he builds a corporate division. He hires the role. He delegates the contents. Your father hired me to be his wife. He did not look closely at what I had been doing for the 4 years before he hired me. He did not want to. And so my grandfather started building. Yes. For years, alone. Almost alone. Adeline's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Lenora Crawford lifted one shoulder again. You'll find out, she said. He was a thorough man. He did not put all his trust in any one place, not even in you. Adeline did not respond to that. She leaned forward instead. She put her face very close to the glass. You took my mother from me when I was 6 years old, she said. Her voice did not shake. Her voice would never shake again about this. You moved into our house. You sat at our table. You wore her coat on the porch for an entire winter because you said it fit you. You came to my school plays. You signed my permission slips. You stood in the kitchen and told me when I was 12 that I had grown into a young woman my real mother would not have recognized, and that you were sorry for that because you had always wanted her to see who I was becoming. Lenora Crawford did not look away. And you killed her, Adeline said. You killed her so you could stand in that kitchen and say those things. Yes. I want you to know, Adeline said, that you did not become my mother. You became the reason I had to grow up faster than any child should have to. You became the reason my grandfather spent the last years of his life in a mountain in upstate New York instead of teaching me to whittle. You became the reason a good man named Silas Tobin died on his own porch with his rifle across his knee. You took my mother. You took my grandfather. You took a kind old neighbor I knew for one morning. And you did not get me. You did not get me because my grandfather did not let you. And I am going to stand in court every day of your trial, every day in the front row, and you are going to look up from the defense table, and you are going to see Cassandra Bennett's daughter looking back at you, and you are going to know for the rest of your life that the canvas underneath was always going to outlast the paint. She stood up. She picked up the recorder. She turned it off. She slid it into her jacket pocket. She walked out of the room without looking back. Outside in the corridor of the federal detention facility, Declan Riley was waiting for her. He had 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. She took it. She did not drink it. She held it for the warmth. You all right? He asked. No. Good. They walked together down the corridor toward the visitor exit. Adeline, Declan said, I need to tell you something. I've been waiting for the right moment, and there is no right moment, and so I am telling you now. She glanced at him. He did not stop walking. Your grandfather, he said, was the reason I am a journalist. She slowed. What? My father, Declan said, worked the Bennett Maritime container yards in Bayonne in the late 1980s. He was a longshoreman. He was not an important man. He made $42,000 a year, and he raised 3 sons in a row house in Jersey City. In 1991, he died in what the company called a stevedore accident. A container fell. The investigation closed in 11 days. The company paid my mother $48,000 in a small annuity, and that was the end of my father. Adeline stopped walking, so did Declan. 3 weeks after the funeral, he said, "A man came to my mother's house. He did not give a name. He gave my mother an envelope. Inside the envelope was a check for $400,000. The man told my mother that the check was conditional on her never speaking publicly about my father's accident. My mother asked the man who he was. The man said he was the man who had hired my father. My mother asked the man if my father's death had been an accident. The man said, 'Mrs. Riley, I cannot give you that answer today. I can only tell you that there will come a year when a Bennett asks you a question, and on that day you will be ready to answer it.'" Declan paused. His voice was very steady. His eyes were not. "My mother took the check," he said. "She paid off the row house. She sent my brothers to community college and me to Columbia. She said nothing for 30 years. She told me on her deathbed 3 years ago the name of the man who had come to her door." Adeline did not need to ask the name. "He paid for your education," she said. "He paid for my education. He paid for my brother's educations. He paid for my mother's house. He found me when I was a sophomore at Columbia through a journalism scholarship he had funded anonymously. He read my college work. He never spoke to me. He never wrote to me. He shaped my career from a distance for 30 years. When he died 2 years ago, I did not know him at all. When his granddaughter sent me an encrypted email last week, I did not know who she was. I learned her name at 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. He chose you. He chose me a long time before I was choosable. He waited. He let me become the kind of journalist who could carry the story he was building. And when he died, he trusted that you would find me when the time came." Adeline could not speak for a moment. She thought of her grandfather on the porch looking at thunder over the ridge. She thought of the careful, patient way he had taught her to whittle. She thought of his hand on her shoulder the day of her mother's funeral. She thought of the long, quiet years he had spent in a mountain. "He trusted us," she said. "Yes." "With each other?" "Yes," she nodded slowly. She drank a little of the coffee. It had gone cold. "Mr. Riley," she said. "Declan. Declan, there is one thing I would like to do when this is over." "Name it." "I would like to take you to my grandfather's cabin." He looked at her. "There is no cabin, Adeline. They blew it up." "There is the foundation," she said. "There is the land. There are 20 acres, and I have a great deal of gold." A slow, tired smile lifted the corner of Declan Riley's mouth. "All right," he said, "I'll come." The first frost came early to the Adirondacks that year. Adeline drove up alone on a gray morning in the second week of November. She drove the same battered green Subaru she had driven up 4 months earlier on the night her father had thrown her out of the only house she had ever lived in. The Subaru, like many things in her life, had survived. It had 2 new tires now. She had kept the cracked headlight. She had grown attached to it. She turned in at the leaning mailbox. 842 Hollow Creek Road. The driveway had been graded. New gravel set in October crunched cleanly under the tires. The trees opened up. The cabin was gone. Where it had stood, there was now only a wide black scar of foundation. The stones of the great fireplace toppled and scattered the chimney, standing alone in the open air like the trunk of a dead tree. The federal agents had finished their work in late September. The forensics teams had recovered every item of significance from the bunker below, which had been deeper and stronger than the demolition charge had reached. The bunker itself, emptied, now sat sealed beneath a layer of fresh-poured concrete in a temporary steel hatch. In the open meadow beside the cabin's footprint, where her grandfather had once cleared a space for a vegetable garden, there now stood a single granite stone. The stone was waist-high. It had been hauled up from a quarry in Vermont. It had been carved by a stonemason in Lake Placid who had not been told the full story, only enough of it. Adeline parked the Subaru. She walked across the frost-stiff grass to the stone. She crouched down in front of it. The carving on the face of the stone was simple. There was a wolf at the top. Its head lifted, its ears pricked forward. There was a small, deep eye carved cleanly into the wolf's face, and at the center of the eye the stonemason had set a single brass medallion that had once been pinned to the chest of a young Navy lieutenant in the cold North Atlantic. Below the wolf, in plain letters, the stonemason had cut 3 lines. Walter Wendell Bennett, United States Navy, honor before blood. Adeline reached into her jacket pocket. She drew out the small folding knife with a deer antler handle that her grandfather had given her on a porch in summer when she was 4 years old. She unfolded it. She turned a small piece of cedar over in her hand. It was a piece she had been carrying for 2 weeks. It was the rough beginning of a small wolf. It would not be a great carving. It would not be as good as her grandfather's. It would be hers. She sat down on the cold ground in front of the stone. She set the cedar in her lap. She began to work. The sun rose over the ridge. The pines around the meadow shook off the last of the night's frost. Somewhere in the higher timber, a hound called and another hound answered. A jay scolded from a low branch. A red-tailed hawk turned in a slow, patient circle high overhead. The 20 acres around her had a name now. The state of New York had recognized the designation in October. The papers had been signed in a small ceremony in Albany. The Forest Service plaque, which would be set by spring at the trailhead down by the county road, would read in raised bronze letters, Wendell Bennett Memorial Forest, a protected wilderness in honor of a sailor, a builder, and a grandfather. Donated by Adeline Bennett, granddaughter, in his name. The land would not be developed. The land would not be sold. The land would simply be the way her grandfather had wanted it to be. A place where the canvas was not painted over. A place where every fall the leaves would turn and fall and feed the soil that grew the next year's leaves. And a girl who had been disowned at 18 and had brought down an empire before her 19th birthday could come up the gravel road in an old green Subaru and sit in front of a piece of stone and whittle a wolf out of cedar with her grandfather's knife. The wind moved through the pines. It moved the way it had always moved on this ridge. Long, slow, patient. Adeline lifted her face to it. "They didn't check the canvas, Grandpa," she said softly. "But we did." The wind did not answer. It did not need to. She bent her head back to her work, and the small, bright shavings of cedar fell one by one into her lap. And on the granite stone in front of her, the medallion in the wolf's eye caught the early sun and held it.